Hi everybody and welcome. I'm really happy to welcome everybody to this new format of this new channel that is, we're here today for the first time, and I'm particularly happy to have a very dear friend and very special person in my life, Philipp Rosendahl, one of my most admired colleagues, stage director, friend of mine of many years. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. Thanks.
And so this series, as some of you know, whoever is following us now or is seeing us live, started about 2 months ago on Idagio Live at the time, and we decided to part ways recently, and now we're all independent and free on a new channel of our own, basically, well, a channel of my own on YouTube, and I'm very happy to, some weeks I will have a guest as today, and I'm very happy that Philipp is my first independent guest, and some weeks I'll be by myself, and we're going to do 2 more episodes before taking a summer break, and then we'll see each other again in the fall. So Philipp, thanks so much for joining me. And Philipp and I know each other for many, many, many years, and we're going to talk about a topic that I think means a lot to both of us. But before we get there, as always, we'll start with our word, and our word for today is movement. And I'll just start by asking you, what does movement mean for you? What's the first thing? Because it's got so many meanings that are completely different. What's the first thing you think of when you hear the word?
Well, first of all, I'm mostly afraid of movement just because people have made fun of me so often for my dance moves, for moving awkward, for doing strange things with my body, basically.
Really?
So the first thing, that's what it is. So first thing is fear, actually, that comes to my mind when I think
I would
about
never have
movement.
thought so with you, because to me you seem so comfortable with you, like the way you are. I never have thought so.
Well, that's what it is, but it's but when I think further, it's also something that I use for escaping my feelings. It's like if I'm stuck in myself, stuck with a feeling or so, I start moving, I run away, I escape a condition or so. So it's, to me, a second thing that comes in my mind is like escaping or changing a condition, basically, that I'm in.
Which is also a result of fear in a way.
I guess. So yeah, so a lot of fear comes to my mind.
But
what about you?
But you know, if you look at the 4, let's say, main definitions you find in the dictionary when you look up what movement mean, you basically, I guess, all the things that you referred to somehow are related to movement as a form of taking your body from one position to another, right?
Yeah.
Because if you think about it, I mean, that's what I associated with it too. But if you look at it in the dictionary, you've got 4 completely different meanings, which is one has to do with motion, with changing position. So any kind of change, whether I take my hand from here to that, that's movement. Right. Anything that is changing position, changing location, and so on. But then also a movement is also, let's say, a group of people that all believe in the same political idea, or have the same goal, the same conviction, is also a movement.
It's the political term, right?
There
like
you go. That's a
revolutionary thing.
Exactly. Well, any kind of movement, any kind of group where everybody's united by one wish. But in a way, it's also about moving. It's also about changing something. It's not about changing location anymore. It's about changing a status quo into a different one, basically.
Right.
So, and then of course you've got, in classical music, you've got movement as the parts of a symphony, and you've got 4 movements and so on. And funny enough, the one I find most interesting is that, and we use that in English, we use it in German too, is to be moved by something. Movement is also that something can move you, and it touches you emotionally. So that brings me back straight to where you started, that you said also, I go from A to B, so that's changing location, but you said it's because I want to either run away from feelings or because I'm afraid. So it's somehow you made a connection between 1 and 4. So tell me more.
Well, the thing is, when I think about it more rationally, of course, I connect a lot more positive things with movement. Like, I think it's also, besides what you already said with the political movement, like the changing a status quo, for me, it's also something very spiritual to think about movement. It's I feel like movement is something that's always there. It's always in the world. Everything moves. The sun moves, the moon moves, the world moves, everything moves around you. Even when you think you're still, everything is still moving. Yeah. And it's sort of like, to me, where do you decide to join? Which movement do you decide to join? That's like a spiritual question of life to me.
It's super interesting because actually what I say about sound is that sound is always there. It's just about the question, when do we start perceiving it? So you say basically the same thing. There's always movement. It's just about when we kind of surf the wave with it.
And where we start to listen also. It's a decision in a way. It's a decision, but it's also a decision that's made. I don't know what you think. Do you decide?
I find it fascinating because like for me it's absolutely the same for sound, but absolutely not like that for movement. For me, movement is very much an action that is created the moment that I, as you said, that I decide to start it.
Right.
Whereas sound is something that is always there, and it's just about when I'm tuning my antenna to start perceiving it. Also a symphony, which when I conduct one, is for me, the idea is that the sounds are all in the room. It's just the moment we create them, it's just the moment we enable them. It's not really the moment that we produce something, but it's an illusion, because of course movement is exactly the same, because just as much as a tuba starts producing a sound the moment the player blows into the sound, it's a spiritual thing. You're totally right. But it just, I think because properly to you, movement is closer and sound to me in a way, that that's why I kind of had to, that I needed that abstract distance to it in a way.
I don't know. I don't feel like movement is close to me just because I'm so afraid of it, and I'm so afraid that people would judge me. And I feel like sound. I feel like sound. For me, the word "sound" is a lot closer to me. I feel a lot more confident when I think about sound than when I think about movement, actually. But for me, I don't know. I don't know what about you, or how you would connect those two. What do you think? Like, how does
movement?
Yes, sound and movement.
It's funny that you say that, because for me, movement is first thing I think of is communication in a way. Because I always think in terms of, also with music, is in terms of, in archaic terms of where does music come from? I mean, nowadays everybody's talking about why is music essential, and why is it essential that concerts are played again? Why are orchestras essential? And I always go, and everybody's talking about all these sort of society structures, like, oh, concerts are important because they've been around for 150 years and we all go and see that. And I go like, that is the worst possible excuse to why music is important. Like trying to explain music through sort of bourgeois structures.
Tradition. It's tradition, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
What you're
saying. But in a sense, it's like we're trying to explain one of the most powerful form of communication that have been around for millions of years, or at least thousands that we know of, with a 150-year period of sort of Western bourgeois structures, and that's a way that will fail. But if you go, which is why I always try to go back and go like, what made people want, or what made people create sound to start with? And the two aspects that are so essential to music, one was singing, a song as a form of expression, and one was dance, and movement was a form of communication. That's why all traditional music, whether it's Irish music or whether it's, sort of Balkan folk music, whatever, that you always have the song and you have the dance. Everything is based on one of the two. And then it's like all the other forms came way later. And so I always think of movement, where either it's as we talked before, as in terms of body language, or in terms of a dance, which is a group of sort of ritual. It's, for me, always, it has to do with communication.
Mm-hmm. And you think there's no, so what would be the difference then between the dance and the playing the music, or the singing of the music? Or does it only exist together, you think?
I don't really think it's about exist together, or sorry, somebody's coming into in my room and I have to, hello. I'm just doing a live podcast. Is it okay?
He can join if he wants to.
Yeah, no, I'm having a sort of an unexpected visitor whose office this is, so we're gonna have to take a quick break. I've kind of invaded this office for the past 3 months, so it's more than understandable. So we're talking about West Side Story, and if you would like to join us.
Well, I work with Bernstein.
He worked with Bernstein, so that's actually
nice. So maybe I should just leave and you talk with him then.
He was very nice to me, but I was younger and better looking.
He said he was very nice to him, but he was younger and better looking, which I will not comment on because I think he's wrong. But anyway, see you later. So that was
Where were we? Oh, dancing and singing.
Exactly. So what I don't think that you can separate one from the other, because the idea of pulse is the most essential part of music that I know, and it's also what's sort of in a way lies behind any kind of movement, because we move to a certain rhythm, whether we're aware of it or not. When we walk, we move to a rhythm. When we dance, we move to a rhythm. And the whole idea of why dance connects people is because they feel a certain motion together. And they, at some point, because it has a certain pattern and repeats, they can predict it. And it's the same thing with musical pulse. So I don't think you can, of course, you have later on symphonies where dance motifs have been used, and in a kind of a sublimated way, that it's not anymore about the audience getting up and dancing and while listening. Of course, it's like a symbolic, or it's
why not?
Why not? Because I think that in a way, the moment you dance to music, then the music becomes a little bit like an illustration, which is not, I don't think it's the point. I think there can be situations where you dance and the music is played. I think there can be a situation where you imagine the dance, but it's about a more abstract form of music that is just inspired by it, just as much as there are moments where it's about the movement and the music is just in the background. I think there's there's different kind of levels. And I don't think that in a concert hall, the music that you hear is there to, it's in a way, it's almost like, as I said, sublimated. It's just using like a homeopathic dosage of it for you to kind of to relate to a certain feeling, to be reminded of a certain ritual, not so much for you to actually get up and dance as you would in a nightclub.
So it's like it puts the idea of movement in your head, and you basically you dance spiritually if it works.
I think that if it works, I'd like my listeners, if I play, let's say, West Side Story, I'd like them to kind of have their, excuse me, but asses kind of tickle and then want to kind of get up and move. I just don't want them to actually do it, because I think in a sense that, not because I want them to sit still and listen, it's not about that. It's just because it's never like about playing dance themes for like a whole 10 minutes. It's usually little motifs that are used for that. Even if you have complete dance movements, I like people to feel that wish to do that. But sometimes I find that the wish to do something that you don't do in the moment is almost a stronger feeling than actually fulfilling that wish.
Right. And I wanted to come back to the pulse, because you said pulse for you is the first thing that comes into your mind when maybe that's where movement starts, or that's what's always there, right?
To me, that's where movement starts, and that's where music starts. That's like the human pulse. That's totally the beginning of it all.
And would you say, when you play with an orchestra, or with an orchestra and singers and dancers, or whoever's there, do you believe that there's a pulse? Is it something that's in the room, that's decided by everybody that's in the room, or is it something you bring in and you then, you stand in front of the orchestra and you just feel your pulse, or your pulse with the orchestra? How do you catch what you call pulse? Where does it start? I mean,
I wouldn't even say it's something that anybody brings, but because I don't think it's something that is consistent. I think, and that's like the main, I'd say probably also something I have a big argument with many musicians on, because I don't believe there's any piece of music that has one pulse from the beginning to the end. Just as much as when you have 50 people playing, they will not feel the same pulse in the same way. What I'm trying to say is, like, for me, pulse or time is the musician's material, just as much as paint is the painter's material. So a painter, for a painter, paint is his source, is his material. For us, we paint with time. And therefore, pulse, just as much as, during a day, let's imagine that a piece of music is like a microcosm of life, or it's like a symbol of life. Right. Then throughout a journey, or throughout a life, or throughout a day, or throughout a week, you will have different pulse depending on how you feel. When you're excited, your pulse will be fast. When you're sad, it might, or when you're tired, it might be slow. When you suddenly, you feel fear, it'll change. The pulse is in constant movement. And so just as much as a piece of music for me should be, I don't think 2 bars should be, well, not always, but in many, many cases, there's definitely never a longer period of time where the pulse is always the same. And of course, I have the big argument with a lot of people when I conduct earlier music, I don't know, Mozart or Beethoven, and they say, oh, it's, it says allegro, so it should be in the same metronome speed from the beginning to the end. And I go like, no. This piece is supposed to mirror human life. How do you want it to be in this? Like, your heart does not beat in the same speed the whole day. And so I don't think I bring a pulse into the room. I think I take the energy that the whole room creates and I turn it into a journey that is constantly in constant dynamic. It's in constant development. Which
So
brings me way back to the, sorry, just to the idea of movement, which we talked about, because now when I think about it, all four definitions are about movement, about development, or about change.
Right.
For me, pulse is something that is in constant motion. There is no static pulse by definition, because pulse is about going from one beat to the next, and movement is about going from one place to the next. It's always about, it doesn't matter if it's one, if it's a peace movement to go from war to peace, if it's about being emotionally touched from not emotionally touched, or about me moving my hand from here to there. It's always about development. And for me, pulse is that.
So do you think there's many people in the world that neglect that? Or what happens if you, because you said you had a lot of discussions about this with people saying it has to be the same. They put up a metronome and they say it has to be the same 10 minutes after we started, and the pulse needs to stay. So what do you, like, what would be, if you say the pulse is always there and things are always changing, what do you tell people like that? Because it's completely different philosophy.
It is completely different philosophy. And I've been looking for a way to convince classical musicians better, and I have not always managed. What I always get as an answer is, but it's not written in the score. And I always go like, yes, of course, because in the time of Mozart, you did not write on every second note how to change the time. But you did not do that in the time of Mahler either, in a sense that what Mahler did, for example, or let's say Strauss, who did write on every second note, here go faster, here go slower, here go whatever. I mean, these instructions are great, but at the same time, we all know that music is not something that you can fixate on it. That's why I don't like CDs. It's not a condition that you can freeze. So every time you'd conduct, I don't know, a piece, it would sound completely different depending on the orchestra, depending on the mood, depending on the weather, depending on the audience. So, and you know, the best quote is the quote of Mahler, who said, if good musicians will see my score, they will ignore everything I wrote in there and they will just make great music. But if a mediocre musician sees my score and obeys to all the orders, at least it will sound acceptable. And I think this is what all these instructions were for. But in the time of Mozart, where 90% of the musicians were improvising all the time, and the score was basically like a general instruction book. It was not, I mean, these were not people like today that were just sitting in an orchestra and trying to obey to every dot and every dash. Some of the people that played his pieces were people that were composers themselves. They improvised. Every time was different. It was just a general, almost like a jazz lead sheet. You know, it was follow this line and make music along the way. And so for me to explain, when somebody tells me a Mozart symphony, which says allegro in the beginning, should be the same metronome from the beginning to the end, I think we're on such different wavelengths in terms of how we see music, because I am completely sure, I mean, we know that about Beethoven, the way he played his sonatas and so on, that no composer ever imagined that his piece will be like a military kind of thing from the beginning to the end on the same tempo. And about, let's say, the discussion on how much is a different one. Maybe some people would feel the way I do it is too much, other people might do it less, and so on. But if the fact that the elasticity is the key to music making is something that I've been finding very important, but very hard to convince people that are of a different school of thought, let's say.
But it's interesting, because I feel like classical music, to me, I'm not from the classical world, obviously, it's a very, in a way, to me, the outside is a very stuck concept. Like you know what you play in a year, you know the hall that you're going to play, and you know the orchestra you're going to play with. So have you ever felt like the energy in the room concerning the audience and the orchestra and everybody there? And for example, you have to play in a concert, you play America from West Side Story, okay? And then you come into the room and nothing feels like it. There's no feeling of dancing, of doing this number, of Puerto Rican music. If you say a pulse is always there and it's defined by the room, it's so odd that in the classical musical world, or even in the theater, you say, we say we're gonna do this and that play in a year. How do you react to a situation like that?
I completely relate to what you're saying, and I think you've approached a few things that are very problematic in this industry. And I think now that we have this big crisis, we're going to have to find ways to redefine ourselves if we want to, because we cannot just go and shout all day long, we're important. We're going to have to prove that we are, and we'll prove that through the fact that people will want to hear what we produce. And many of these attitudes that you've described will have to be questioned and must be questioned. But what I find interesting, the 2 points, I don't think that the early planning is the problem, that we plan that we'll play this play or whatever in a year.
Right.
I think there's definitely an issue with routine. If I think about orchestral players that see the same people every day, that go every week to the same place, I think routine and art are two things that don't quite necessarily go together, but it's a very tricky question of how to challenge that. But one thing I think for sure, and I've been finding, for example, I've conducted West Side Story several times, especially the symphonic dances.
Mm-hmm.
I find it, for example, in Germany, particularly difficult because there is a lot of orchestral players who are extraordinarily well trained find it very hard to relate to that idiom. And they find it hard to relate because, like in the US, if you play that, people can associate so many things with it. They know the whole idea of dance, of jazz music, of pop music is much more integrated in the education. It's integrated in the culture. It's integrated in your childhood. Whereas in Germany, people are trained to play with beautiful sound. They're trained to obey to notation in a very impressive way. And I have a huge admiration for the journey that it takes for a violinist from starting to play at the age of 5 to then make it to get an orchestral position. It's a huge journey, and to get that quality. But at the same time, I always say sending every orchestral player in Germany to play to improvise in a bar every Saturday night for half a year will help them more than 4 years of college.
But don't you think, especially with West Side Story, you're saying it's difficult and to do it in Germany? I feel like when Bernstein wrote it in the 50s, it was sort of, in a way, it feels like when you're doing that piece, as if that's what he kind of wanted from it. He wanted to challenge everybody. It's the only piece of opera or music, or some say musical theater, that every discipline says it's theirs. You know, the dance department comes and says, no, West Side Story is a dance piece, and the classical department comes and says it's a symphonic opera piece, and the musical theater people come and say, no, it's a piece of musical theater. It's the first real musical theater with sampling and stuff like that. And in a way, I feel like what you said, that it's so difficult to do because it feels like people are so stuck in their departments. That's one of the ideas or the visions of this piece, to bring those people together and to challenge everybody, because nobody's going to be good at everything. Nobody's going to play the trumpet like this and like that, do it in the classical and the jazz way. Nobody can sing as it has to be sung in this piece and move as some people move in this piece. So I feel like it's, in a way, it's an utopian idea to bring all these people together and make people do things that they normally can't, or they feel uncomfortable with.
But then the question is, what is it that they have to dance like or play like? What is that ideal? I mean, he created a completely new aesthetic with this piece, or they created. And
right.
Do we know how should it be played, or how should it be sung? Is there a way it should be sung, or is it also just as much an open thing to ask, how should it actually be played?
Well, yes. I mean, I don't think there's the one way. Of course, we know the movie from the 60s. Most people in the world refer to that movie as this is how the West Side Story is supposed to be done. If you look how it was done on Broadway in the 50s, it sounds very different actually. The whole sound of it, the look of it is different than from the 60s movie. And the movie is what we think West Side Story should look like or should be like.
And what I find, by the way, even more dangerous is a lot of musicians just know the recording of Bernstein from the 80s,
right.
which was done with, classical singers, and they think that's the only way it has to be done. And that's a whole third aesthetic, completely different than the first two.
And actually, Bernstein wrote about this recording that he wanted to do this recording. He wanted to have a nice, like, classical recording of it. And he said, of course, this is not how it's supposed to be done on stage. That's what he wrote about it.
Before he agreed to do the piece, to write it, like in the very beginning in the 40s, before they even agreed to do it together, but they started and then they left it to put it aside for some years before that. He actually wanted it to be much more an opera than a kind of a musical, and then it became, and he wanted to be much more classical, but then at the end it went into a totally different direction, as we know. But what you said before, I want to go back to that, because what I love about this piece is exactly what you said. You cannot put it in the box. It's not a musical, it's not an opera, it's not a theater piece. And that's why I think it's so visionary, because it predicted exactly for me the topic of the 21st century, because, you know, in music as well, we've been through so many centuries of styles, you know, from Renaissance to Baroque and Baroque to classical. I mean, we're not considered styles at the time, but let's say periods where a certain aesthetic was considered right. And then, you know, after the 20th century, where everything was broken and everything was done that can be done, we cannot invent anything new. We've seen everything. I think the future of the 21st century is it's about the eclecticism of fusioning things together. It's about different art forms coming together, but it's also about different musical styles coming together, which is why I think this piece is so visionary, because he predicted in the early 50s that the topic of the future will not be about let's break another style into a new style, but it's about bringing styles together. And we are in the very, very, very beginning, not to say we have not even started that process. If you look at how, as you said, exclusive all departments still are. I mean, classical musicians, I mean, look at new music today. I mean, there is a 5% niche in classical music that calls itself contemporary music, and most of it you don't want to hear, nor do we, nor does the audience. But like the sort of avant-garde classical music, but how much really fusioned new music is there? You have the hip hop in the hip hop, and you have the, you know, the pop and pop, and you have rock and rock, and you have all those things in their own departments. And some of them do come together, but in the classical world, there is almost zero fusioning.
And that, of course, is a mechanism of shutting people out. No matter if it's classical music or any other field. If you say, you know, the only way to do something is only like this, and the only way it has to look is like this. And I can say the same thing about the theater world. I mean, there's a very certain style of how you do theater in Germany. There's a very certain style of how you do straight theater in Great Britain and stuff like that. So it's things are still very, how do you say? I don't know the word, but it's.
I mean, you can say it's stuck, but in a way, it's very conservative.
In a way, it's very conservative, right? And because I was just thinking when you said Bernstein wanted to have a more opera version of West Side Story, I thought maybe it was because I know that Jerome Robbins, the guy that directed and also choreographed the first production of West Side Story on Broadway, he got into the boat quite early on in the process, as did Arthur Lawrence and Stephen Sondheim. So I guess they worked.
Lawrence was the one who conceived it to start with, wasn't he? He was like the one who wrote the book to start with.
Arthur Lawrence.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But they were all coming from very different fields, especially Jerome Robbins and Arthur Lawrence. He was more of the intellectual writer, and then the mover, and then the composer. And I don't even know, because if you look back now on West Side Story, you think it's this visionary project, and of course you never know. People never know when they create visionary projects while they do it. I mean, I don't think that Bernstein sat down and said, I'm going to do a visionary project right now, but he was forced in a way by Arthur Lawrence and by Jerome Robbins to move out of his comfort zone. And of course, he has a very rich background conducting all sort of different music. But this is maybe it's more of an example of how, when you work together with different people from different worlds with different mindsets, how you can create something that you wouldn't be able to create by yourself.
I could not agree more. And I think what you said is also super essential. I don't think you ever think about something while you make it and think this is going to be innovative. And I think this is also the problem, that all those worlds that you've described that are so stuck, they're so stuck in thinking they're innovative. They constantly believe that they're doing something incredibly original, but although they have not moved anywhere for the past 50 years, as does most or a lot of avant-garde classical music, as does a lot of avant-garde theater, as you said. But the worst thing is not only how stuck it is, it's the fact that it's stuck but thinks it's avant-garde. And the point is, I don't know any great piece of art that was ever created, as you said, when the creator thought, ooh, how do I do something new? The creator was just thinking, how do I express my need to express art? And that the audience or the critics or history decided at some point that it's new and innovative. And I completely agree with you. I think actually most of the comments that we know by Bernstein about like, oh, I don't think anybody will be able to sing that, or it's going to be so hard to play and so on, they came afterwards. While writing, all they wanted is to write a piece together.
and they had no clue. I mean, if you hear them speak, I think they had a pre-Broadway run in Washington D.C.
Yeah.
And if you listen to what they said before their opening night in Washington, D.C., they had no clue what they did. All of them said, we love this piece, we love what we did, but maybe it might close tomorrow. They had no idea what was going to happen. It's really interesting.
As was the case with so many masterpieces in history. It's crazy, you know, how many pieces. I mean, that I know, even pieces that are not so well known, like Korngold, you know, his F sharp symphony that was a huge flop that didn't even get premiered the first time. You know, pieces like that, or can't remember now which, but it's a Mozart opera that was a huge flop in the beginning. I don't remember. There was some operas in history that were massive flops when they started and then became huge successes, or pieces where the composers thought they're going to be flops became a success, or vice versa. It's crazy, you know. You can never know. And but the one important thing is, if you're busy thinking about that, is if you're busy commenting yourself and thinking constantly while writing on how good is what I'm doing, or how innovative or how relevant it is, you're bound to create shit, excuse my language, because you're way too busy with your impact. Whereas the only way to create something that is relevant is you're busy with your creating a connection between yourself and your art, not between your art and the world.
And that's what you call pulse, right?
Well, that could not be a more beautiful ending. Philipp, thank